Hello students. In our early lecture, we have discussed about the the terms that are prescribed for us. Now we have to study more in detail about the theories. As we have seen that each and every knowledge has its own theory. If we have any critical judgment evaluation pattern that we just needs to think about. So when we discuss about this, we must understand what type of theory it is, what theory wish to convey us, and what the theory is generally all about. So we just need to understand the theory of the particular, say, branch of knowledge, term, concept. So the theory is very important when we have to understand the literature. We have so many theories in English literature, concepts, critical theories, the theories that are required to evaluate, to form the critical judgments, some typical tendencies, some approaches, and these tendencies and approaches are very much important in the literature. As we have seen in the theory of literature, the text is very important because it gives us the theory about literature. In what way the literature is, how it is written, in which category does it fall. Every art, there is some kind of a human expression. It's a work of art. It may be art, pictures, sculpture, literature, paintings, any kind of art conveys some kind of a deep human expression, imagination, or reflection of that particular moment that the writer or the artist wish to convey. In respect to our syllabus or our term, we must understand literature is also an expression. Literature is also an art, but it is in the form of words. The medium changes. The raw material for the literature is just language. But for other, say stone for the sculptor, colors and canvas is for the painter. So, for the writer, for the author, language is the material out of which he creates his work of art. So, literature is also one of the fine art. It as a medium. Language is the medium for the literature. It is suggestive. It is symbolical. It is figurative. And at the same time, it conveys some kind of a meaning. And that is what it is meaningful too. And because of this medium, literature is considered as one of the finest arts. René Willek and Austin Warren, who defined the theory of literature, nature of literature, and function of literature. The language used in literature is different from the language that we use today in speaking, in non-literature rather. There are science books cannot be called as a literature, or there are management related books they cannot be called as literature. So, what makes literature as typically different one? What are the peculiarities of the literature? So, we just need to go through the nature of literature and subsequently we will go through the function of literature. See, the nature of literature that we just need to think about. The nature of literature, the first problem that confronts us is what is the subject matter of literature, what is literature and what is not, how we can find it. A simple way of defining literature is that everything that is in print, we shall call it as literature. As Edwin Greenlaw has argued, nothing related to the history of human civilization is beyond our province. We are not limited to bells and letters or even to printed or even manuscript records in our effort to understand the civilization. He says, we must see our work in the light of its possible contribution towards the history and towards the culture. This is Greenlaw's theory, and many literary studies has thus become not merely closely related to the history of civilization but identical with it. See, so history is not in the sense, or literature is not in the sense preoccupied with printed or written matter. Necessarily, its primary source is taken from the time, the history. See, there are other, say, study of everything that reads that needs to be thought over in the human civilization, in the history of civilization. All distinctions, all criterias are being introduced into literature. So literature will be judged as valuable. This literature and its identification with the history of civilization is a denial. So there is another way of defining literature is to limit it to great books, which may be in whatever subject are notable for literary form of expression. Here the criteria is either aesthetic worth alone or aesthetic worth in combination with general intellectual distinction. Within lyric poetry, drama and fiction, the greatest works are selected on the aesthetic ground. Other books that are picked for their reputation or intellectual eminence together with aesthetic value. This is a common way of distinguishing or speaking of literature. It has some distinct aesthetic value due to its style, composition, general force of presentation as a novel as a whole, as a poem as a whole. एकंदरीत साहित्याला एक वेगळ्या दृष्टीने प्रेझेंट केलेलं असतं. सौंदर्य दृष्टिकोनातून स्टाईल, शैली, कंपोजिशन, रचना, संरचना आणि एकंदरीत प्रेझेंटेशन हे सर्वच बदलतं. फक्त एवढंच नाही आहे, त्याच्यामध्ये काही व्हॅल्यू ऑफ जजमेंट असतात आणि त्यामधून आपण काही व्हॅल्यू ऑफ जजमेंट त्या ठिकाणी ठरवू शकतो. आता बहुतेक लिटररी हिस्ट्रीज असतात, त्यामध्ये काही फिलॉसॉफर्स, ट्रीटमेंट हिस्टोरियन्स, थिओलॉजियन्स, मोरालिस्ट, पॉलिटिशियन्स आणि इवन सायंटिस्ट हे आपल्याला पाहायला मिळतात. आणि म्हणून हे आपल्याला लिटररी हिस्ट्री 18व्या शतकामध्ये इंग्लंडमध्ये कशी होती लिटररी हिस्ट्री हेही आपल्याला त्या ठिकाणी समजून घ्यावं लागेल. बट दुसरा भाग असा आहे का ह्या सर्व गोष्टींमध्ये we have to understand the contribution made by other historians like Gibbon, Bishop Butler, both as a Christian apologist and moralist, Adam Smith, an economist. Okay, in most literary histories, these thinkers have discussed in a fragmentary vision without proper context. So there is the subject, the question that naturally comes. Literary history is not automatically transformed into a proper historian of these disciplines. It becomes, or the author becomes simply a compiler and self-conscious intruder. So great books are definitely great one. We all must seek to present the idea to the students at the beginning of the students that students should read great and good books, not just compilations of histories or curiosities, but the students should read great books and good books. So in the history of imaginative literature there are certain limitations because in great books we don't have the continuity of literary traditions, but there are certain, say, literary genres, literary processes, there are social, linguistic, ideological and other conditioning circumstances that figures in the literature. See, as the term literature seems best if we limit it to the art of literature and only to simply imaginative literature, if we limit it to the simply imaginative literature, there are certain difficulties in employing them. So, imaginative literatures are clumsy and misleading. So, one of the objections to literature is its suggestions of limitations to written or printed literature. See, they made particular use of language in literature. Language is material of literature as we have just discussed. See, language is a creation of man, and that is what it is empowered by cultural heritage. So, what is the distinction between literary language and scientific language? Because we have seen language is a material of literature. So, as per Thomas Pollock, the nature of literature, though true as far as it goes, seems not entirely satisfactory, especially in defining the distinction between literary and everyday language. The problem is crucial, by no means simple in practice of since literature. The other forms of arts has no medium of its own, since many mixed forms and subtle transitions undoubtedly exist. The mere contrast is between thought and emotion or feeling is not just sufficient. Literature does contain thought. While emotional language is by no means confined to literature, witness a lover's conversion or an ordinary quarrel. Still, the ideal scientific language is purely denotative. It aims at one-to-one correspondence between sign and referent. The sign is also transparent. See, as as we have seen that the scientific use of language is definitely envisioned with the concepts, but the imaginative language, it has some objective force, some pragmatic element, some intellectualized element, didactic element. At the same time, scientific language doesn't have. Literary language is far more deeply involved in the historical structure of language. It has its expressive, pragmatic side as we see. But scientific language is just mere pragmatic. So, there is another distinction that we should make, that the language used in everyday use and literary language. Everyday language is not a uniform. The everyday language has so many variants. It is colloquial. It may be commerce language, it may be official language, it may be a religion, slang of the students. Obviously, there has been much more about literary language. It holds for other uses. Everyday language has its expressive function. Though this varies from colorless official announcement to a passionate plea roused by a moment of emotional crisis. Everyday language is full of irrationalities, contextual changes in historical language. There are moments when it aims to a scientific language. In literary type of language, the signs or the sounds or the symbols or the actions and puns, we have such a awareness that repeatedly occurs. But in everyday language, there are the language used for actions to achieve results and to influence attitudes. So it will be a false. But of course, there is very much say difficulties that we see when we have to differentiate between everyday language and literary language. It is thus quantitatively that literary language needs to be differentiated from varied uses of everyday language. The resources of language are exploited deliberately and systematically. Certain types of poetry will use paradox, ambiguity, contextual change of meaning. Poetic language organizes and tightens the resources of everyday language. And many of these resources, a writer will be formed, the author will be formed of this. Still, every work of art imposes an order, an organization, a unity. This unity sometimes seems very loose, but it increases the complexity and close knit structure of the poems. See, the distinction is much more clearer. If we think language use of literary language and everyday language, both has the pragmatic, say, orientation. Poetry is just a rhetoric to definite the outward action. Genuine poetry definitely affects us. So art is such a one that imposes some kind of a say framework into a semantic analysis. We thus can reintroduce some of the common conceptions of aesthetics. We must realize that the distinction between art and non art, between literature and non literary linguistic utterance, is just a fluid. It would be a narrow concept of literature to exclude all propaganda, art, and didactic and satirical poetry. We must recognize the transitional forms like essay, biography, and much rhetorical literature. See, in the different forms of literature, the nature of literature it has emerged more clearly in referential aspects. The center of literary art is obviously to be found in traditional genres of lyric, epic, and drama. In all of them, the reference is to the world of fiction and to the imagination. The statements in novel, in a poem, in a drama are not literally true. There is a central and important difference between a statement. See? So this distinction between a literary use of language, pragmatic use of language, makes us think that literature or literary language has something distinct qualities that we do not see in another case. In the historical perspective, we see how similar are naturalistic novels in its choice of themes and characterization, ways of conducting dialogue. We, we can easily identify the conventionality of naturalistic type of writing or scene in the time and space. We easily find the way the characters enter and leave the stage. If we find and recognize the fictionality, invention, and organization of the distinguishing trait, we just find that Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Balzac, there will be, say, such a kind of a art. At the same time, one common misunderstanding of that needs to be thought over that we will see in our next lecture. See.